In the dusty streets of a frontier town where reputation meant everything and judgment came swift as a gunshot, she walked alone. The townspeople whispered behind lace curtains and crossed themselves when she passed. Too wild to love, they called her, as if wildness were a sin that stained the soul. But love has a way of finding the most unexpected hearts, even in the harshest places. What happened next would shake the very foundations of their small community. When a man stepped forward to claim her as his wife, defying every social convention, the story took a turn nobody could have predicted. 300 scouts, hardened men of the frontier, would ride not to condemn, but to bless a union that challenged everything the town believed about love, acceptance, and redemption. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that proves love conquers all. Subscribe for more incredible tales from America's past, and drop a comment about what true love means to you. The year was 1876, and the town of Cedar Falls, Wyoming Territory, had seen its share of rough characters. But none had stirred as much controversy as the woman they called Sarah Mackenzie. She'd arrived on the morning stage 3 months prior, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and secrets that seemed to follow her like shadows. Sarah wasn't like the other women in Cedar Falls. While proper ladies kept their eyes downcast and their voices soft, she looked men straight in the eye when she spoke. Her auburn hair often escaped its pins, and she wore practical boots instead of delicate slippers that would sink into the muddy streets. The trouble started when she took work at Murphy's saloon, not as one of the painted ladies upstairs, but as a bookkeeper. She had numbers in her head like nobody's business, could read and write better than most men, and wasn't afraid to tell a drunk cowboy exactly where he could take his unwanted advances. "That woman's got the devil in her," whispered Mrs. Abernathy to her sewing circle. "Mark my words, she'll bring nothing but trouble to this town." The other ladies nodded their heads in solemn agreement, their needles clicking faster as they discussed Sarah's latest transgression. Sarah had been seen talking to the Paiute traders who came through town, speaking their language with surprising fluency. In a community where most folks viewed Indians with suspicion at best, her easy conversation with them marked her as different, dangerous, and decidedly unwomanly. The final straw came when she intervened in a fight between 2 drunken miners outside the saloon. Instead of screaming for help like a proper lady, she grabbed a bucket of water and doused both men, then told them to take their grievances somewhere else, or she'd call the sheriff. Word spread quickly through Cedar Falls. Sarah Mackenzie was too wild, too independent, too unladylike for any decent man to consider. The bachelors who might have courted her began to avoid her entirely, warned off by the disapproving clucks of the town's matriarch families. But there was one man who noticed Sarah differently. Captain James Hartwell had arrived in Cedar Falls just 2 weeks after Sarah, leading a company of Army scouts stationed at the nearby fort. He was 32, weathered by years on the frontier, with kind eyes that seemed to see past the surface. James first encountered Sarah when he came to Murphy's saloon to settle accounts for his men. While other patrons grew rowdy and crude, he sat quietly at a corner table, nursing a single whiskey and watching the woman behind the bar who handled herself with such quiet confidence. "You're new here too," Sarah said one evening, approaching his table with a fresh bottle. Her directness caught him off guard. Most women waited for men to initiate conversation, but Sarah never followed most women's rules about anything, and James found her honesty refreshing after years of stilted frontier politeness. "That I am," James replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "James Hartwell, and you're the infamous Sarah Mackenzie I've been hearing about." His tone held no judgment, only curiosity, and Sarah found herself sitting down despite every instinct telling her to maintain distance. They talked until the saloon closed that night. Sarah told him about her childhood in Colorado, how she'd learned Paiute from her father who traded with the tribes. James spoke of his years scouting for the army, the loneliness of frontier life, and his dreams of someday settling down. Over the following weeks, James became a regular visitor to Murphy's saloon, but not for the whiskey. He came to see Sarah, to talk with someone who understood the complexities of frontier life, who didn't judge him for the hard choices he'd had to make. The townspeople began to notice Captain Hartwell's frequent visits. Whispers started that even a respectable army officer was being led astray by that wild Mackenzie woman. The pressure from the community began to mount, with several prominent citizens suggesting that James might want to find more suitable companionship. But James Hartwell was a man who'd faced down hostile war parties and survived blizzards that killed lesser men. The disapproval of Cedar Falls society didn't intimidate him in the slightest, especially when he was falling in love with the most remarkable woman he'd ever met. The romance between James and Sarah blossomed despite the town's growing disapproval. Every evening after his duties at the fort, James would ride into Cedar Falls to spend time with the woman who had captured his heart completely. Their courtship was unconventional, conducted in plain sight rather than hidden behind parlor doors. Sarah would finish her bookkeeping duties at Murphy's saloon, then walk with James through the dusty streets of Cedar Falls. They talked about everything: literature, politics, the changing frontier, their hopes for the future. James discovered that Sarah had read more books than most college graduates he'd known. The town's reaction grew increasingly hostile. Mrs. Abernathy organized what she called concerned citizens meetings, where the topic was always the same: how to rid Cedar Falls of Sarah Mackenzie's corrupting influence. "She's bewitched, that poor captain," Mrs. Abernathy declared. "A decent man wouldn't associate with such a creature." Reverend Thompson felt pressured to address the situation from his pulpit. During Sunday services, he preached about the dangers of loose women who led good men astray. Though he never mentioned Sarah by name, everyone in the congregation understood exactly who he meant, and the disapproving glances intensified. The pressure reached James through official channels when Colonel Matthews, his commanding officer, summoned him for a private meeting. "Hartwell, I've been hearing disturbing reports about your association with a woman of questionable reputation in town. Perhaps it's time to reconsider your social choices for the good of your career." James stood at attention, but his voice was steady and sure. "With respect, Colonel, Sarah Mackenzie is the finest woman I've ever known. The gossip about her is based on small-minded prejudice, not fact. She's intelligent, honest, and hard-working, qualities I value more than the town's narrow definition of propriety." The Colonel's expression softened slightly. He'd known James for 5 years and respected his judgment, but the complaints from Cedar Falls were mounting. "Just be careful, Captain. Sometimes a man's heart can cloud his better judgment, especially out here where women are scarce and loneliness runs deep." Meanwhile, Sarah faced her own pressures. Murphy, her employer, called her aside one afternoon with obvious reluctance. "Sarah, you're the best bookkeeper I've ever had, but some of my customers are threatening to take their business elsewhere if I keep you on. I'm sorry, but I might have to let you go." Sarah nodded with understanding, though the news hit her hard. Work was scarce for women in Cedar Falls, especially for one with her reputation. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Murphy. You've been kinder to me than most in this town. I'll start looking for other arrangements immediately." That evening, when James arrived for their usual meeting, Sarah told him about losing her position. She tried to sound matter-of-fact about it, but James could see the worry in her eyes. Without steady work, she'd have no choice but to leave Cedar Falls, and they both knew it. "Marry me," James said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. "I know it's not the romantic proposal you might have dreamed of, but I love you, Sarah. I want you to be my wife, and I don't give a damn what this town thinks about it." Sarah stared at him in shock. She'd hoped for this moment, but never dared expect it, not with the entire community against her. "James, you don't understand what you're asking. Marrying me would ruin your reputation, maybe. Even your career. The town would never accept me as an officer's wife." "Then we'll make them accept it," James replied, with the same determination that had made him a successful cavalry officer. "I've spent my whole life fighting for what I believe in. I'm not about to stop now, especially when it comes to the woman I love." The proposal spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Within hours, everyone knew that Captain Hartwell intended to marry the scandalous Sarah Mackenzie. The town's outrage reached fever pitch, with some citizens threatening to write directly to Army headquarters to have James removed from his position. But James had made his decision, and Sarah, after a sleepless night of consideration, had made hers. They would face whatever consequences came together as husband and wife, no matter how hostile the world around them became. Word of the engagement reached the Army fort before James could officially inform his commanding officer. Colonel Matthews summoned him immediately, his face grave with concern. "Hartwell, I've received several letters from prominent Cedar Falls. Citizens demanding your transfer. They claim you're bringing disgrace to the uniform by associating with this woman." James stood firm despite the mounting pressure. "Colonel, I intend to marry Sarah Mackenzie with or without the town's approval. She's done nothing wrong except refuse to conform to their narrow expectations. I won't abandon the woman I love because of small-town gossip and prejudice." The colonel studied James carefully. He'd seen good officers destroyed by poor personal choices, but he'd also seen James's character tested in combat and found it solid. "Very well, Captain, but understand this. If you proceed with this marriage, you'll face consequences beyond just social disapproval." Meanwhile, Sarah prepared for what she knew would be a difficult wedding. No church in Cedar Falls would perform the ceremony, and no respectable family would attend. She'd accepted that their union would be witnessed only by a justice of the peace and perhaps a few sympathetic souls. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, James's second-in-command, approached his captain with news that would change everything. "Sir, the men have been talking. They know you're getting married, and they know the town's giving you grief about it. They want to do something about it." "What kind of something, Sergeant?" James asked, though he could see the determination in O'Brien's weathered face. The Irish sergeant had served with him for 3 years and had never failed to speak his mind when something mattered to the men. "Well, sir, we've been thinking, if the town won't give you a proper wedding, maybe the army should. We've got nearly 300 scouts stationed here, and every man jack of them respects you. They're willing to ride out and make sure your wedding gets the celebration it deserves." James was stunned by the offer. Military weddings were typically reserved for senior officers or special occasions, not for controversial unions that had divided an entire community. "Sergeant, I appreciate the sentiment, but I can't ask the men to involve themselves in my personal affairs." "Begging your pardon, sir, but you're not asking. We're volunteering. The boys have seen how that woman handles herself, and they respect her for it. Anyone who can stand up to a whole town's worth of bullies has earned their admiration. Besides, we figure if 300 Army scouts show up to bless your marriage, even Cedar Falls might think twice about their objections." The news spread through the fort like prairie fire. Soldiers who had served with James in dangerous campaigns, men who had trusted their lives to his leadership, began making preparations for what they declared would be the finest wedding Wyoming Territory had ever seen. Sarah learned of the soldiers' plan when James told her that evening. She was overwhelmed by the gesture from men she barely knew. "They're willing to do this for us, for me. But James, won't this cause even more problems with the town and your superiors?" "Maybe," James admitted. "But Sarah, these men have followed me into battle. They know what real courage looks like, and they see it in you. They're not doing this just for me. They're doing it because they believe in what's right. The wedding preparations began in earnest. The soldiers decided to hold the ceremony at the fort rather than in town, where it would be a military affair. Conducted with full honors, they requisitioned supplies, polished their uniforms, and prepared to make a statement that would echo far beyond the borders of Cedar Falls. Word of the soldiers' support reached the town and created a new dynamic. 300 armed men showing their approval for Sarah Mackenzie carried weight that social disapproval could not match. Some townspeople began to reconsider their harsh judgment, wondering if they had misjudged the situation entirely. Mrs. Abernathy and her circle of disapproving ladies found their influence suddenly diminished. It was one thing to gossip about a scandalous woman, but quite another to oppose the unified will of the U.S. Army. Even Reverend Thompson began to soften his tone, speaking instead about Christian charity and understanding. The transformation in Cedar Falls was gradual but unmistakable. Shopkeepers who had refused to serve Sarah began nodding politely when she passed. Murphy reinstated her position at the saloon, claiming he'd reconsidered his earlier decision. The power of military support was changing hearts and minds throughout the community. As the wedding day approached, James and Sarah realized they were about to participate in something far greater than a simple marriage ceremony. They were making a statement about love, acceptance, and the courage to stand against unjust social pressure, backed by 300 of the frontier's finest soldiers. Chapter 4. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright over Wyoming Territory. At Fort Harrison, 300 Army scouts prepared for what would become legendary as the most remarkable military wedding in frontier history. Every uniform was pressed to perfection, every brass button polished until it gleamed like gold in the prairie sun. Sarah Mackenzie stood in the small quarters that had been prepared for her, wearing a simple but elegant dress that Mrs. Murphy had quietly offered from her own collection. The saloon owner's wife had approached Sarah the previous evening, apologizing for the town's treatment and expressing her desire to help make the day special. Captain James Hartwell, dressed in his finest dress uniform, complete with ceremonial sword and the medals he'd earned during his years of frontier service. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar, not from nervousness about marriage, but from overwhelming gratitude for the support his men had shown. At precisely 10 o'clock, the gates of Fort Harrison opened, and an extraordinary procession began. 300 mounted soldiers rode out in perfect formation, their horses' hooves beating a rhythmic thunder against the hard-packed earth. Each man carried himself with the pride of the United States Army, creating a spectacle that commanded respect. The column stretched nearly half a mile as it made its way toward Cedar Falls. Leading the procession were the color guard, carrying the American flag and the regimental standard. Behind them rode Captain Hartwell and his bride-to-be, followed by the entire company of scouts in their dress uniforms. The townspeople of Cedar Falls came out of their homes and businesses to witness the unprecedented sight. Children ran alongside the procession, wide-eyed with amazement. Adults stood in respectful silence as the military might of the frontier rode through their streets in support of a love that had challenged their deepest prejudices. The wedding ceremony took place in the town square, with Justice of the Peace William Garrett officiating. He had volunteered for the honor after Colonel Matthews made it clear that the Army expected full cooperation from local officials. 300 soldiers formed a perfect circle around the couple, their presence both protective and celebratory. "Dearly beloved," Justice Garrett began, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Captain James Hartwell and Miss Sarah Mackenzie in holy matrimony." The traditional words took on special meaning, surrounded by the pageantry and power of military support. Sarah's voice was steady and clear as she spoke her vows, promising to love and honor the man who had defied an entire community for her. James's response rang with the same conviction that had made him a natural leader, declaring his devotion before God, the army, and anyone who cared to witness it. When Justice Garrett pronounced them husband and wife, 300 voices rose. In a cheer that echoed off the surrounding mountains, the soldiers drew their sabers in unison, creating a ceremonial arch under which the newlyweds walked, their faces glowing with joy and triumph over adversity. The celebration continued throughout the day. The soldiers had prepared a feast at the fort, complete with music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Many townspeople, their attitudes transformed by the display of military support, joined the festivities and offered their congratulations to the couple they had once shunned. Mrs. Abernathy, the town's former moral authority, approached Sarah during the reception with tears in her eyes. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Hartwell," she said, using Sarah's new name with obvious effort. "I judged you harshly without knowing your true character. Today has shown me how wrong I was." The wedding became the talk of Wyoming Territory and beyond. Newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco carried the story of the army captain who married the woman his town called too wild to love, and the 300 scouts who rode to bless their union. Sarah and James Hartwell built a life together that proved their critics wrong at every turn. She became a respected member of the community, using her intelligence and strength to help other women who faced similar challenges. James continued his distinguished military career, eventually retiring as a colonel with Sarah proudly at his side. Their love story became a testament to the power of courage over conformity, of individual character over social pressure. In a time and place where reputation meant everything, they proved that sometimes the most important opinion is the one you hold of yourself, especially when backed by those who truly know your worth.